I made 50,000 in the stock market today. I had twins. I went to the poor farm. I'm on Millionaire Acres. That's life.
All right, so the Game of Life is a children's board game. It was created and co-designed by Ruben Klamer and Bill Markham in 1960. I want to talk about how important game rules are to how we end up actually interpreting a game. I think a simple game like this actually really highlights how games can pull this off. Let's start with talking about the movement in the game, right? You have a little card token and you move it around the board. And there's actually a few different things that you need to consider in terms of movement in this game and how it's simulated. The way that the movement actually begins is by spinning a spinner. And when you spin the spinner, it lands on a number, and that's the amount of spaces that you move forward. But it's specifically that number of spaces, and it's also only forward. You can't go backwards. It's all linear. You start at the beginning, and then it moves forward, and that kind of gives us this sense that time is moving along. And I think that's important because the idea that moving around on the board is also the same thing as moving forward in time isn't necessarily obvious, and whatever narrative springs up from those interactions is going to be tied to the visual narrative that you present, and they're going to affect each other in the way that the game is understood and interpreted in the end. It's a very simple foundational thing. You're moving your car forward on the board, and that represents time because the tiles narratively imply that. So what's the Game of Life about, right? Let's try and interpret it. In the context of a simulation, which is the intended context according to the creators, the Game of Life is an epitaph generator for the specific conditions of a long, privileged American life, devoid of death and predetermined by fate. Life begins at the crossroad between college and work, choice between debt or limited future options, marriage is obligatory, children are happenstance, and you have to pay for speeding. So all those interpretations, they all sprung from the rules of the Game of Life. At least for me, that's something I can look at that game and say those things, and it didn't come from nowhere. It's how I interpreted the rules. And you might interpret them differently, but just the fact that an interpretation springs forth is the point I'm getting at. Anyway, there's a second form of wealth called life tiles. And life tiles are gained mostly by landing on spaces. So these tiles have life events written on them. And that's funny because since the object of the game is to have the most wealth, the game is kind of forced to quantify the value of life experiences. So what happens if we change the rules? Does the interpretation change? Would we still be able to make the same conclusions if we were to change the rules? Because you could argue that it's somewhat arbitrary and that you can interpret the game however you want. But I do think that by changing the rules, you end up with different interpretations, which is interesting. That means that there's some sort of link between the actual rules themselves and possible ways that we can interpret it. Maybe, right? Okay, so we're gonna change some of the rules, and you can try this at home if you have a copy of the Game of Life. We're only gonna change 3 of the rules. First thing we're gonna do is we're gonna change how you move in the game. So right now, when you roll, or when you spin the spinner, you move exactly the number of spaces that it says on the spinner. So we're gonna change that so that you move up to the number of spaces. So if you roll a 3, you can move 1, 2, or 3 spaces. The second thing we're gonna do is we're gonna change the goal of the game. Instead of trying to have the most money, we're going to make it so that you have to have the most life tiles at the end of the game. And then the third change is that in order to get the life tiles, when you draw them, you have to pay the amount that's listed on the tile. So I encourage you to take out your copy of Candyland, Monopoly, whatever game that you're very familiar with that has a simple rule set, and change some of the rules and see how that changes your experience with the game. And I think that if you do that enough times, you'll get a deeper understanding of how this web of rules does what it does.